Hello everyone and welcome to WhatCulture Gaming. I'm Josh, joined as ever by Ashley Ash Millman, because today I have been playing a lot of Blair Witch over the past week or so, and it is quite an interesting game. If you like the Blair Witch property, you might like this title, but it's a kind of standard horror game, a modern horror game, where it kind of blends walking simulator aesthetics, where you're kind of just following a very rigid path with kind of some light combat. Yes. And that's where I take a sort of issue with it, because over the past few years I've played the likes of Blair Witch or Soma, or a bunch of different kind of AA horror games, which links to a podcast we actually did yesterday that you should totally check out on the YouTube channel. But yeah, I feel like when it comes to horror, the one problem that a lot of horror games make is with the combat, and for me it stops making these titles really scary or fulfill their potential, because it introduces a gaming aspect that we've all come to expect from video games. More or less, virtually every big video game is about combat in some form, whether it's avoiding it in stealth or, you know, actively attacking monsters. And I feel like every single time a segment like this gets introduced, I just stop getting scared and start getting frustrated. Blair Witch, admittedly, doesn't have much of it. You have to fight these spooky dudes in the woods with your flashlight. You essentially just shine a light in their face. Is it like Alan Wake in the It is actually like Alan Wake. You shine a light in their face about 5 times, and then these scamper away. And it sounds like it could be fine, but every single time it pops up, you're just kind of like, well, here's a combat scenario, and it stops whatever suspense was being built, and it just becomes kind of like a frustrating, okay, he's the gameplay, as it were. And Ash, am I just going crazy? Is it just me thinking this, or is this something that gets in your way of enjoying horror games?
Well, I think it is a fundamental problem with horror, that the difference between our experience of I always bring this back to film and games, because there's a difference between a film and a game. A film, you're locked in, you're watching, whereas a game, it's active, so it's the passive and the active. And combat is the ultimate active experience, which is what makes it so difficult to get right. I can't really think of a horror game that really hits the nail on the head, because make it too easy and it's just a gimmick, and it's not, it doesn't actually add anything to the game. Make it too difficult and it takes everything away from the horror aspect and makes it a dysfunctional game sort of thing.
I'm so pleased you've actually said that, because the problem I have with games like Blair Witch, which are kind of these AA games, they're not quite the big, you know, monumental blockbusters that have all these different mechanics in them. Usually there's only a couple when it comes to combat. I feel like the combat itself is kind of seemingly just thrown in on a whim because you kind of need to check a box, rather than because it's complex or interesting or really all that engaging. And because it's kind of so surface level, it just sort of stops whatever tight focus that the game has elsewhere, and it's really frustrating. I think you can do good horror games with good combat. For me, I think Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 7, and The Evil Within 2 are really good examples of great horror games with sort of robust mechanics where you can feel empowered and yet also disempowered. But I feel like there's a level of complexity and polish to that experience that just a lot of games either don't have the resources to achieve, or just get the balance completely wrong, and then you're completely messed up.
Well, when they do put combat in, it's quite a rarity to have a full horror game that is a horror game that actually has combat in. Usually they just take it out because it's the easiest way of making something scary, because you have to run and hide and you have nothing to fight back with, which is the whole experience of, oh my god, I can't do anything, which is fundamentally very scary, and I'd probably stand by that as the best way of doing horror combat, is just to not do it. But then when you are talking about your Resident Evils, even stuff like Bloodborne, where like obviously that thrives on combat, the whole thing of that is combat, but it's still a horror tinged game. It turns it into an action experience rather than a horror experience. I think it can be done right, and I think it can be enjoyable. But the one thing that gets me the most is death that comes with it, because then you again, I've spoken about this before, but the predictability of death, because you have to die to make combat worth something. And once you've died, then you know what you're coming up against again, which is what reinforces the I'm annoyed at this aspect, because I have to keep doing it and going through the same thing to try and get through it. But it also just keeps giving you the same experience, which means anything that was scary in it, you know what's coming, and the unpredictability of horror is taken away, it's washed off, and you're just there hacking your way through whatever bloodied body horror manifesting crazy thing is there, and it doesn't do anything anymore.
Well, that's exactly what put me off Outlast 2, because I love the first game and I actually really like the second one, but because you have more open levels and you actually have to run away from a lot more ghastly gals, I felt like I was running into dead ends and getting caught by that. The monster with the big tongue, I can't remember what it was, he's got like no jaw, but he's got this giant tongue and he goes up and he sort of like licks you. I hope I'm remembering this right and it's not just a weird nightmare I had, but I do.
It's what the bloody, oh my god, the image you have of that woman licking your face.
Oh yes, the Frau Engel from
There we go.
Wolfenstein 2. It's like that, but even more horrific. No, but every single time I ran up to this monster, I kept getting caught. There was one segment where I just kept dying and dying and dying. And that's fine. That might be just me being bad at the game. But that also broke the horror because every single time I kept seeing this guy's face up close and personal and seeing the detail of it, he suddenly stopped becoming scary and started becoming an obstacle. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these horror games, is that the enemies are just obstacles. They're just something to get past. And once you die to them once or twice, or you get stuck once or twice, they just become sort of, you can see them as AI sort of figures rather than these kind of creepy, unknowable, like demon monsters. Like even when it goes back, even going back to Blair Witch, the reason those fights become frustrating is because every single time you see one of these guys jitter behind a tree, it's always the same thing, and you can kind of goad the AI into doing kind of the same thing over and over again, so you can kill them instantly, because you kind of want to do it because you want to just get to the next objective without being, obstructed. But in breaking the AI in that way, or at least sort of highlighting the limitations of it, it's kind of, you find out what this horrific, unknowable monster is actually made of, and it's just kind of a few scripts and programming, and that sort of does take away the kind of suspense from the situation. I think wouldn't really happen in a movie, or maybe it would if you saw the monster too many times, or in the case of Jeepers Creepers 3, he's just in the middle of a field in broad daylight. You're like, well, that's not scary anymore. It's sort of like it's like the gamified version of that. Jeepers Threepers should be the official title.
There isn't really a right way of doing it, because you're always going to come up with this. The only thing that would actually make it continually scary and continually a horror experience is to take away the mechanic of death and replace it with something unpredictable. So if you die, that you don't know what's going to happen next, you might get put somewhere else in a map, you might get an experience with a different monster. Like a good game, I don't know if it exists, but a good game that could happen is if every time you die it takes you to a nightmare sequence and you have to like battle your way through it to get back to where you were or something.
Oh, there is a game like that I just can't remember what it is now. I'm sure that some games have sort of tried to do that, but they are very much the exception, like you said. When it comes to dying mechanics and death mechanics, I feel like they are a big problem. There's a really great video essay by someone called, I think, Joseph Anderson, who sort of talked about horror games and why
don't scare him anymore.
Why they don't scare him anymore, and how that just knowing that you can die and not kind of be punished for it kind of ruins a lot of the suspense, because there's no stakes to your character failing. I partly agree with that, but I certainly agree with the fact that if you're just doing the regular action game thing of dying has no consequences and you just get kicked back to a checkpoint to do the same thing over and over again, that only breeds repetition and frustration, and I don't really know how you can solve that without thinking of a kind of wacky solution to it, whether it's what you said there, having to fight your way through a nightmare scenario to crawl your way back. But I feel like there should either be more consequences for dying, or kind of, I don't know, something unique like that. Because I mean, going back to Resident Evil again, a game which does this very well, the old Resident Evil games, you had to save at typewriters. And I know that was very contentious, and it might have knocked you back a lot of progress if you hadn't been saving, but it did sort of make you appreciate death much more. It wasn't just kind of an inconsequential thing of, oh, this monster's gonna bite my face off, and fair dues, I can restart. You would lose a lot of progress, and I feel like it maintained a mystique around the enemies that you just don't get if you just get instantly another go at it, and then you get to see his creepy face again up close and personal, and it's kind of like, well, what am I supposed to be scared about here? I don't really know.
You need new levels of fear for it, and another level of fear is losing all of your game save data. That's definitely a very real fear to tap into.
Fear.
But I think Hellblade as well, not technically a horror game, but has horror aspects in it. Having the idea of if you die too many times, that the darkness takes over you and then you have to start the whole thing again. I think that's another nice way of adapting the death mechanic to add maybe another layer of fear, as in like just worry. Having a worry and a stress level to a game also functions in the same way for horror, I think. I think having a high level of tension or stress and not really having an enjoyable, oh my god, this is great to have experienced, is kind of more what it should lean into as well. Like even if that is playing with mechanics to make it really brutal, like Bloodborne as well, and stuff from the Dark Souls series, which takes loads of H.P. Lovecraft kind of influence from these eldritch abominations and all that sort of thing. Having high stress, high pressure, high tension sort of experiences is another angle of doing horror that works quite well and leans into combat actually functioning as something useful rather than here we're gamifying what could be a film.
It's sort of like when, like this new wave of horror games started being birthed around the 2010s or whatever with Amnesia and stuff, and you kind of saw that there where you wouldn't have regular sort of stealth or combat mechanics, but you kind of couldn't look at enemies because it made you insane or whatever, and it kind of played with, enemies in a unique way where it wasn't just sort of the same encounter over and over again, or at least it did a good job of kind of hiding that. Because I think it's very linked to what you said earlier about the structure of horror in general. Like in movies, you see that played out so well. Directors have to have a tight control over how they build the horror and how they pay it off. You know, bad horror is just a jump scare that comes out of nowhere and it shocks you with no real setup. But I feel like you need to have a real tight control over how the audience kind of, you know, builds a scene in that way. And obviously in movies, that happens naturally because you are not in control and you are only subject to what you're seeing. But those lines are blurred when it comes to video games, because even if you have an element of control, even if you're just walking, like you might turn around and completely miss a scare, which I have done a couple of times.
Purposefully a lot.
A lot. But I feel like at their worst, horror games sort of blend the two. They have the like the structured scares, the linear scripted scares, and then they have gameplay segments. And I feel like the worst ones don't really marry those together. They're just separate entities. It's kind of like, here's your scripted sequence, and then we're going to go into a gameplay sequence, and then we're back into the other one. Whereas a really good one, in my opinion, would blend the two together, so it's almost seamless, where combat itself seems scripted. I know scripted in general is a very dirty word, or at least it was back when story-driven games were very big. But I feel like when it comes to horror, you need that structure.
You do. I feel like films and horror as a genre succeed so well on set pieces. You need tension building, like slow burning. We don't know what's going to happen, and then you get that, oh my god, this is the worst that could happen. It's horrible. There's loads of scary monsters, and then you need to take a step away from that. Whereas games, it's very much a lot all of the time, because it has to bombard you with all of these themes to make it feel like it's the scariest experience ever. Because you get desensitized to walking around a hellscape, and being in control of walking around a hellscape. Obviously, I've mentioned these a lot recently. There's supermassive games like Man of Medan, Until Dawn. That's going to be the perfect example of a horror game marrying scripted and doing what you want as well. But that functions very much as an interactive film.
Well, exactly. It's very telling that leans far more heavily into the conventions of film than perhaps regular games, and it kind of, for my money anyway, it sort of pulls off that balance much better, just because it's so well paced and so well structured in a way that a lot of games just kind of aren't, especially when the emphasis these days in modern horror games are kind of on player freedom. Blair Witch actually does a really interesting thing where it sort of toys with how much freedom you have, because it gives you the wide open woods. Obviously, it's a Blair Witch game, so you spend a lot of time in the woods, but obviously with that comes a lot of different paths. But if you go down the wrong way, for instance, it will loop you back around, which is scary in itself. It's cool. It gives you the illusion of freedom, while still keeping you kind of on rails and keeping you scared by doing something unique and messing with your perception of reality. I just thought that was really kind of fascinating.
Yeah, that's really good. There's such a good link to the films and the whole time travel. Oh my god, that's lovely. I like that. I like that that's in there. I think another good example of one that's the playing with unpredictability again. As much as it's predictable, you're going to end up on the right path. It's toying with your expectation and then what actually can happen. And an old one, I feel like an old cult classic one that needs to be brought up is the SCP Foundation thing.
What is this?
It's like a roguelike. It's based off the creepypastas, where it's all these people have written up monster categories. There's one that's literally just a weird looking blobby statue that if you look at it too long, it will kill you, like the Weeping Angels and all that sort of thing. But it's kind of like a roguelike where it's procedurally generated, so you don't know what rooms you're going to find, don't know what SCP monsters you're going to find as you go through. And that was a really good way of just it's pretty crap now, but it's a good way of using unpredictability, using not knowing what's going to happen. You can play it so many times over because you don't know where everything's going to be and what's going to happen and what's going to follow you and where it's going to crop up and how it's going to affect you. And I think that is the key point of horror games, and combat can work well within that. If we bring it back to our main point, which is combat, combat can work well within that when it's your one way of surviving an encounter that you don't know you're going to be in. But if it's, oh my god, here's a load of monsters that you have to kill to carry on, that's when it kind of becomes a bit grating, I think. Definitely,
I think you just need to maintain that element of surprise, like games like that do, and the sort of use weird mechanics. I remember playing some browser games back in the day, and in one of them, or a couple of them, had kind of those weird files where it would sort of pop something up on your computer, and that used to freak me out because that's sort of playing with form and playing with structure in a really interesting way. More of my final points. just to sort of, highlight how little I think emphasis should be on combat, is there was a great game called Soma. I'm not sure if you played it.
Oh, yeah, I know it.
It's this lovely sci-fi horror game where, from the creators of Amnesia, so you had those same kind of stealth sequences where you had to creep around these weird underwater monsters, and that was kind of the most frustrating part of the game, because everyone just sort of, wanted to see how the story developed and was reveling in the atmosphere, and every single time you got to one of these arbitrary kind of, missions, that kind of suspense came to a halt. And then later on, the development team actually released an update called the safe mode, which meant that you didn't have to interact with the enemies. They were there, but you didn't have to engage with the gameplay. You could just treat it as if it was sort of an exploration or walking simulator game. And for my money, that was a better way to play the game, because it removed the frustration and didn't lose anything from a kind of suspense level. Although, you would imagine that, having no enemies or not having to sneak around these guys would be sort of, boring or not scary. It was kind of the exact opposite, because it wasn't frustrating anymore.
It's layers of fear, isn't it? Like the layers of fear DLC and everything as well, where you just walk around and go, whoa, that's a bit spooky, and then carry on with your day. Like, I feel like that was a good way of doing it as well, because it's about, horror games are about the experience of fear, not so much about the experience of a game. So it's combat is a difficult one to wrangle between.
You know what? That's a lovely way to end. I have nothing better to sum this video up than that lovely sentence. But I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Do you agree that combat is kind of ruining horror games? And do you have any solutions to these problems? Be it a new way to kind of have a fail state or game over, or just taking the enemies out entirely like Soma did, which is kind of a good idea. But either way, while you're down there, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't, though, I've been Josh, joined by Ashley Millman, and we'll see you soon. Bye.